It's Levi Brackman here with Truth, Jewish Wisdom for Today. Thank you so much for joining. Before I begin, if you like this podcast, please leave a review, subscribe, like it wherever you listen to this podcast, whether it's on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, wherever you listen to this podcast. Please like it, subscribe, leave a review. That helps other people also find the podcast. Thank you so much. And now on to this new episode of a brand new season of Truth's Jewish Wisdom for Today. And the name of the season is Torah Portion Uncensored. So what I'm going to try and do in this season is just talk in the most straight up, clear, uncensored way about the Torah portion. It's going to be based on the text of the Torah portion, and it's going to be based on ideas found in medieval Jewish philosophy, as well as reflections based on life today, and seeing the text in view of the evidence that we have from ancient times all the way till this day, and how things seem to have shaken out. What is different about this podcast, which is on the Torah portion? So first of all, it's not going to include biblical criticism. Now you might ask, why not? Biblical criticism is really important. Well, it's because whilst the documentary hypothesis sheds light on the different meanings of the text itself, and a lot of people would argue that totally indispensable to understanding the text, when I personally read scholarship based on the documentary hypothesis, it doesn't excite me. When I study the Torah portion, I take into consideration ideas found in the documentary hypothesis, but this podcast is not going to be about that kind of biblical scholarship. What's also not going to be about, it's not going to be your traditional inspirational ideas found in the Torah portion. It's not going to bring the Kli Yakar and Rashi and the Rashbam and the Abarbanel and other commentators. It's not going to try to bring it all together with some latter-day Mefarish or some latter-day commentator in which we find inspirational. It's not going to be any of that either. So it's not going to be your traditional fare of Divrei Torah. Instead, it's going to be a reflection based on a critical analysis and thinking of the Torah portion, and also with the wisdom that perhaps is relevant today, but not from what one might see today as the Torah view of things. Going to look at it from an independent perspective. And that's why I'm calling this season of the podcast Torah Portion Uncensored, because I'm going to totally uncensor myself. So I'm not going to try and pander to anyone. And like I said at the end of the last season, that when you come to study Torah, you're supposed to study Torah to try and find the truth of what's going on. And when I say the truth, I don't mean the absolute empirical truth, but I mean what the text is trying to actually convey. And in this case, not just the text itself, but also how tradition has seen things as well, how Jews have always looked at this and how Jews practice it today, based on the text. So it's trying to get to the underlying meaning of the text itself in a very honest, clear-eyed fashion, not trying to pander to anyone, not trying to excite or make anyone individually happy, but just trying to give you an unvarnished, uncensored view of the Torah portion each and every single week. So, not biblical criticism. It's not going to be your regular fare of a Dvar Torah, taking the ideas found in the Torah with some of the Rishonim, some of the earlier commentators from the Middle Ages, through to some latter-day Achronim and their ideas in the portion. I'm not even going to look at the Achronim. So I'm not going to be looking at anyone who's really made a commentary on the Torah portion post the 1500s. We will, though, look at some of the medieval, some of the Rishonim, especially people like the Rambam, found in the Moreh Nevuchim, people like Saadia Gaon, found in the Emunas V'Deis, the Book of Beliefs and Opinions. Also, the Kuzari, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and also people like the Ramban, Nachmanides, and other medieval-type commentators will take their views into consideration as well as I present this podcast. Now, we're starting this at the very beginning of the book of Leviticus. I thought when I started this, it would have been much more fun if I would have started at the beginning of the book of Genesis, because you've got the creation story, you've got the stories of Abraham, you've got the stories of Isaac, you've got the 12 tribes, you've got Jacob, you've got all these very fun and interesting stories which are fodder for really good episodes. Leviticus seems to be sacrifices. I mean, it's called Teras Kohanim. It's called the laws of the priesthood. So not as exciting, I thought. But actually, as I've delved into it, I'm really excited to be starting this season with Leviticus. But before I get into Leviticus, I want to continue to talk a little bit about the approach of this season of the podcast about the Torah portion, called Torah Portion Uncensored. I very much take the viewpoint of people like the Kuzari, people like Maimonides, and people like Saadia Gaon. These are all medieval philosophers in how they view our religion. Because each of them in their own way basically say that reason is totally indispensable to being able to understand our religion and being able to get to God. So reason is the fundamental building blocks that you need. Without reason, you can't ever get to any kind of metaphysics. In the Kuzari, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi talks about the fundamental approach to religion, and he says that the whole idea of all the miracles that took place for the Israelites in Egypt and the exodus from Egypt, all the way coming up to the time when the Israelites received the Torah on Mount Sinai and there was this collective revelation, was all to bring about the evidence to show that there is a God, and God is the one which is presenting these commandments, and you should accept these commandments. So the Israelites, when they accepted these commandments, and when they accepted the Torah, to them, that was evidence-based. That was based on the fact that they actually saw God speaking. They saw God's miracles, and they saw the revelation at Sinai, and it felt true to them, and because of that, they accepted it on face value, and they accepted the Torah on Mount Sinai, and they submitted themselves to the will of God. The next part of the argument he makes is that, well, because that happened, and it was a collective revelation, therefore we need to take that as evidence from then and for all generations. Now, that's the next step of the argument, and one could argue for and against that. I certainly feel that God should be presenting evidence in each generation, and that which happened 3,500 years ago, one could argue is not enough evidence to convince us today that we should accept that which happened 3,500 years ago as being the absolute truth. In other words, for many of us, when we look back and we say, well, the ancient Semites in the desert saw that as fact, and for them that was good enough evidence to say that that was God revealing himself to them, and therefore they should accept that, that may have been good enough evidence for them, but without us going back and properly analyzing the evidence that they had, it's difficult for us to accept that in the same way as evidence. And therefore, a God who wants us to re-accept him as his God really needs to show us evidence, or at least refresh the evidence. And one might say, well, this is controversial. Well, there are parts of which the Talmud, which seems to agree with me, because there is a story in the Talmud where it says that God, at Mount Sinai, took the mountain and turned it upside down, and he held it over the Israelites. The words used are Kaf alehem har kegigit. He took the mountain and he held it over their heads upside down like a barrel. And he said to them, if you accept the Torah, great. If not, I'm going to bury you right here and I'm going to turn the world into nothing. In other words, you have to accept the Torah. And the Israelites felt forced to accept the Torah at that time. And there is one of the views in the Talmud which says, well, that could be a good argument. After one dies and one stands at the pearly gates and one stands in front of God in order to get judged, if one believes that that happens, one could say, you're asking me to do all these commandments? Well, I didn't really accept it. I was forced to accept it. And that seems like a good argument to be made. Well, one can make the same argument that, well, God revealed himself back then, and it was really compelling 3,500 years ago to the ancient Semites as they left Egypt and as they stood at the foot of Mount Sinai. But for many people, that same circumstances as is presented to us today doesn't feel as compelling without re-examining that evidence. And we don't have an ability to really re-examine that evidence properly, except for what's written in the book. And for many people, they don't feel that that is compelling enough. So it behooves God, therefore, to then refresh the evidence for us, one might argue. And that certainly is an argument, or a similar kind of argument, that is being made in the Talmud itself. Just because we're right next to Purim, one might argue that that's why you had the story of Purim, where the Israelites then re-accepted upon themselves the Torah. Kimu v'kiblu aleim. They accepted again the Torah upon themselves, this time willingly. So, but that was back then as well. That doesn't mean that it's accepted every single time, willingly, even till this day. So, what I'm saying is the Kuzari's argument, however, has two parts to it. The first part to his argument is that God needed to show the evidence to the Israelites in order for them the first time to accept God and his Torah. It was based on evidence. And then there's the second part to his argument, which is that because they accepted it, therefore it was an historical event, and therefore everyone needs to accept it for all generations. I'm saying that part of the argument is less compelling. But the first part of the argument is really compelling, that this is a religion which is based on evidence. It's not based on blind faith and trust. It's not based on the trust and faith in one person, and neither is it based on blind trust, but it's based on the assumption that the Israelites and the Jewish people are going to look at the evidence and then make a decision based on the preponderance of the evidence. So that is how we're going to look at the Torah in this season. We're going to look at it based on reason and evidence. Reason is fundamental to Judaism. Maimonides, in the guide, has an argument which is somewhat similar to this, which he says, and throughout the seasons of this podcast, I've brought up this multiple times, that he talks about the eternity of the universe. And he brings two examples of philosophers who talk about the eternity of the universe, Aristotle and Plato. And Aristotle is of the opinion that the universe was created out of prime matter. In other words, the matter of the universe was always here, and the universe, therefore, was eternal. There was no one point in time where God created the world. That doesn't mean Aristotle doesn't believe in a God. He just thinks that there was no point in time when the world was created. Maimonides says that if Aristotle was able to demonstrate that point of view, then he would reread the story of creation, which is found in the beginning of Genesis, in line with that point of view. He says that he doesn't accept that for two reasons. One is he doesn't feel convinced by Aristotle, and he feels more convinced by the argument of Plato. And Plato's argument is that perhaps there was prime matter, but at some point in time, God created the world out of that prime matter. So there was a God which is involved with the creation and took the prime matter and formed the universe out of it. Whereas Aristotle doesn't believe that God gets involved at all with any of the creation. There's God, and then there's the world, and he doesn't get involved with the world necessarily. Everything just happens based on the laws of nature. Whereas Plato believes that God gets involved and actually has formed the world out of this prime matter. So Maimonides thinks that if we're going to believe in the eternity of the universe, then we would read it better the way Plato says it than the way Aristotle says it. But even that, Maimonides doesn't seem to fully accept. He thinks that the argument for creation ex nihilo, something from nothing, is a better explanation. The second reason that Maimonides gives why he doesn't want to accept this is because he says that if he accepted Aristotle's point of view, then there really isn't any room for religion at all. So, yes, he could perhaps reread many texts in line with Aristotle's view, but really make the whole religion not look very compelling at all, because a religion is really based on the fact that you have a God who comes in nature and tells people what to do. And if you don't have that, you take that away, then it's much more difficult to explain anything about religion. So he'd prefer to use, if he had to accept the view of the eternity of the universe, he'd prefer Plato's view, where he doesn't have to radically reread the very foundations of the religion. But what seems interesting here is that Maimonides seems to be of the opinion that if he had to, he would reread the entire religion to fit in with Aristotle's view, if that was required. In other words, if that's what the evidence showed. And as a matter of fact, the example he gives is that we reread entire portions of the Bible in light of the fact that we no longer think that God is corporeal. So because we think that God is not in any form physical, therefore, all the verses and passages in the Torah which seem to indicate a God which is corporeal, a God which is physical in some kind of way, are reread in a metaphorical sense, which takes it out of its corporeality and takes it out of any of its anthropomorphic nature. So Maimonides says we've already, based on new evidence which tells us that God isn't corporeal and is not anthropomorphic at all, we've already reread passages in the Bible in light of that, and therefore he says it's not a big deal. If we had to, we would reread passages in the Bible to be in light with new evidence that comes up. Whether that's Plato's view that the world was formed out of prime matter, or even Aristotle's view, which says that God never gets involved with the universe. He's willing, if he can be shown that that is the case, to reread the text in a radical way to be in line with that as well. So we're in good company when we say that we look at the evidence and we look at reason, and then we read the Torah based on evidence and reason, rather than saying that we first and foremost look at the Torah, and then we look at the evidence, and then we look at the reason, and we reread evidence and reread reason based on what's written in the Torah. So that is one of the fundamentals of this season in the podcast called Torah Portion Uncensored. And that is that we're reading the Torah portion based on reason and evidence, rather than coming and saying that the text is what the text says, and if that goes against reason, we accept the text rather than reason and evidence. And in my preamble to this podcast, and I'm going to get into the whole idea of the sacrifices in a moment, so we might go on long, but there's a reason why I think this is really important. I was in the synagogue last weekend, and I was talking to a young man there, very intelligent, well-read, educated young man, Orthodox. I won't say from which section of Orthodoxy it comes from, but he was telling me that today, in order to be religious, you have to really suspend your reason. If you're going to come to religion with reason, it's very difficult to be Orthodox today. Those are his words to me. And I said to him, but that's not our religion. Judaism is a religion which is based on reason. The second you suspend your reason, you really suspend the religion entirely. The starting point is reason. The starting point is evidence. That's where it all starts from. You never come along and say, well, one second, the Torah tells me this isn't a microphone, it's an airplane, therefore it's an airplane. We're never asked to do that. If the Torah told us this was an airplane, we would have to reread that text in some kind of symbolic way, rather than reread reality to say this is not a microphone, rather that it's an airplane. The point is that the Torah never tells us something which flies in the face of reality. The Torah never tells us anything which flies in the face of reason. The Torah will never tell us that 2 plus 2 makes 5. And if you think it does, then you've misunderstood the Torah. That's a fundamental principle of our religion. And by the way, this isn't just something that I read from Maimonides, and it's not something that I just read from Yehuda Halevi or Saadia Gaon or one of the other medieval Jewish philosophers. This is a principle that I was taught by one of my teachers when I was a young student in the Chabad Yeshiva, Rabbi Yoel Kahn of blessed memory, who was very famous and prominent in Chabad. He explained us this principle very clearly. He says the Torah will never tell you anything which flies in the face of reality. So we start off with reality. We start off with reason, and then we understand where the Torah fits in to all of that. So that's the principle of this season of the podcast. It's a reason and evidence-based podcast on the Torah portion, and we're going to be as honest and straightforward as possible about what is written in the Torah portion each week. So now let's jump into Leviticus. Leviticus is also called Torah Kohanim, which is the laws of the priesthood, and it starts off about sacrifices. But before we get into the sacrifices, it's really important to try and take a step back and think about, where does this come from? Let's think about it from the perspective of the ancient Semites living in the setting which the Torah presents us that they lived in, which is in the desert. Let's rewind. How do they get to sacrifices? Well, first and foremost, they were in Egypt and they were slaves, and there was all these miracles, the 12 plagues, and then there was the exodus from Egypt. There was the splitting of the sea, and then there was coming into the desert. Moses going up 40 days on Mount Sinai. There was the golden calf. Then there was the punishments for the golden calf. There was the erecting and building of the tabernacle. And that's basically where we're at. The tabernacle is being built, and that's where we're holding in the progression of the story. What was this tabernacle? What was it all about? What was the purpose of it? So according to Nachmanides, and it seems to me that the Kuzari, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, also seems to be of this opinion, and also seems to make sense, that if you're an ancient Semite and you're in the desert, you see that God is speaking to Moses. Moses goes up the mountain and he speaks to God face to face. And you have this whole experience of the revelation at Sinai, where God comes down on Mount Sinai and he speaks the 10 Commandments. And this experience is overwhelming. You have a divine revelation. Each and every person who is standing at the foot of Mount Sinai becomes a prophet in their own right. They're able to listen to the voice of God himself. But that's a one-time event. It only happened once. What the Israelites wanted to do, or what they needed to do, was to productize that, to use an expression which is used very often in the tech world. What does that mean? That they wanted to be able to take that God speaking on Mount Sinai, put it in some kind of can, so they can now have it with them wherever they go. And that's really what the tabernacle was all about. According to Nachmanides, the tabernacle was a kind of technology, ancient technology, through which God would now talk to the people in this world. The only time God really spoke to the people before that was on Sinai. Well, now they wanted to have something where God would talk to them regularly. They needed something with which to be able to receive that transmission. The construction of this tabernacle was there in order to be able to receive the communication from the divine. And in their mind, this was the technology which enabled the reception of divine communication. If they built this tabernacle, and they built the ark, and they had the altars, and they had it made in this particular way, and the priests would wear these particular types of garments, and they followed these types of rules associated with the tabernacle, then there would be a receptivity to the divine. The technology would be built in a way in which the divine would be able to now speak to the Israelites. So think of the tabernacle as the technology which was able to receive divine communication in the physical world. So it's where divinity, which is, one might argue, is everywhere, but it can't express itself unless it has the right technology through which it can express itself. Think about, for example, radio waves. Radio waves are everywhere. A radio is able to accept the radio waves through its antenna so that you can listen to the radio. So in a similar way, when God wants to communicate, there needs to be something which can receive God's communication, and that's really what the tabernacle was all about. So prior to that, it could only happen on Mount Sinai, and that was a one-off event. But you want to take that and create it so that God can communicate regularly, you need to have some kind of technology, and that was the tabernacle. Now, through this, you have all these laws, And the question is, well, what happens if we contravene these laws? Maybe God gets upset and stops talking to us. Well, there has to be some kind of way in which we can appease God. And the way in which God is appeased is through these sacrifices. Well, at least that's what it seems. If you're an ancient Semite, you might say, well, we've now got this. God spoke to us on the mountain. Now we created this technology so that we can productize it. So now God is now able to communicate with us regularly. This is our tabernacle, which is our technology which enables God's voice to be heard on top of the ark, between the two cherubs, between the two cherubim. God speaks. And in the beginning of this week's Torah portion, actually, God calls out, Vayikra. God calls out to Moses. So it works. The technology is working. So now it's all ready. We have the tabernacle. It's working. The technology is working. Now the problem is, well, what's going to happen if the Israelites sin? They sinned before. They upset God with the golden calf. What's going to happen now? Well, there has to be a way to appease God. And that, it seems, is where the sacrifices come in to appease God. So from the Israelites, this makes perfect sense. If you're an ancient Semite in the desert, you've got it all worked out. You've got the place where God can come and rest his glory, speak to people. The technology is there. And we've got a way, if we make a mistake, to appease God through the sacrifices. But let's take it from a more modern perspective. The fact is that we don't have sacrifices today as the Jewish people. There is no temple where people are slaughtering animals and bringing them up on the altar to God to appease him. There is a huge amount of ink spilt in the Torah about sacrifices. But we seem to have done away with that entirely. Now you might say, well, that's because the temple was destroyed. But we do have Israel again. And if we wanted to, we could probably build a temple to God and bring sacrifices. Why have we not done that? As a matter of fact, there's a lot of discussion about why that has not been the case. And I think it's Rabbi Akiva who basically says, well, the reason why we don't do that today is because we don't know the right color of the garments of the priest, therefore it wouldn't work. Well, frankly, that seems to me to be an excuse. Because, I mean, there are many things we don't know exactly how they happened in the time of the desert 3,500 years ago, but we still are doing it today as Jews. So why, for example, tcheles, we don't know that kind of turquoise, which is supposed to be in the tzitzit, but people are still wearing tzitzit. So why wouldn't we build the tabernacle just because we don't know the exact color of the garments and what they're supposed to be? So the fact is that sacrifices aren't on the agenda today for Orthodox Jews. So what's really going on, and what are the sacrifices, and how symbolic are they really? I'm going to review a number of different approaches to sacrifices and then give my perspective on it. So the first view I'm going to give is found in the Kuzari, and others also hold a similar perspective. And that is that sacrifices are there in order to be able to elicit and inspire and arouse within the individual the desire to repent. And that is because what happens here is that the animal is slaughtered, its blood is sprinkled, and it's burnt on the altar. And the individual can think that this is happening to the animal, but it could have happened to me. So life is precious, life is tenuous, and life can be over very quickly. And an animal has life, and when it's slaughtered, its blood is sprinkled and it's burnt. That might elicit some kind of comparison between the person bringing the sacrifice and the animal which is being slaughtered, and think that this could happen to me. And just like the life of the animal is given by God, so too is the life of the individual bringing the animal was given by God and is dependent on God, and therefore that bringing of that animal and sacrificing that animal will inspire the individual to want to repent to God, to return to God, so that his life continues to be supported by God and that would cause him to repent from sin. And the sin obviously is something which disconnects the person from God in this point of view. So that's one perspective. That perspective is found in the Book of Beliefs and Opinions by Sadiagon, Nachmanides, and others who see the idea of sacrifices in a similar vein. There are, however, other perspectives, and I'm going to focus on two other perspectives of sacrifices. One which is found by Yehuda Halevi in the Kuzari. Yehuda Halevi was a poet, and he was a philosopher, and he lived in the 1100s, and he wrote this book called the Kuzari, which is a fictitious conversation that he's having with the king of the Khazars, who's looking to convert to Judaism. And in it, he talks about the sacrifices. His perspective on the sacrifices is not just the sacrifices on their own, but the sacrifices in combination with the tabernacle, and not just the tabernacle, but also all the garments of the priests and the entire service and order of services that goes on in the tabernacle. The analogy which Yehuda Halevi gives is that of the human body, reason, and the soul. And he says that just like the human body needs to eat to sustain itself, and you need a functioning body, you need the heart, you need the head, you need all the sinews, you need the liver, you need the kidneys. All of that is needed in order for the body to function. And if it's all set up in an orderly fashion, then you have the ability for the soul to rest on the body, and not just the soul, but also reason to rest on the body. And a person can then reason with his mind. But if the person isn't healthy, then the person is not able to reason as well as they could if they were healthy. Well, in order for the soul to give life force to the body, it needs to have a healthy body. But he points out that doesn't mean that you can't have reason, what he calls king reason, without food. And that reason and the soul doesn't need food. But if you want the body to be able to transmit that reason, then it needs food, and the body needs to be healthy, and it needs to be orderly, etc. So in a similar way, he says that in order for God to transmit itself to humans and to rest within the Jewish people, it needs a tabernacle, and needs a tabernacle in a specific way. And then also it needs all these sacrifices, and the sacrifices are like food, but God doesn't need the food. This is something that the people need to do with the sacrifices and with the orderlies of the tabernacle, with all the different manner in which the sacrifices are brought up, and the different types of sacrifices, and the types of garments, and the purity which exists within the tabernacle. All that is needed in order for the divine presence to be able to rest in the tabernacle, and then to transmit down to the Israelites, the Jewish people. Similar to what I was talking about earlier on in the view of the Ramban, Nachmanides, who saw the whole tabernacle as a type of ancient technology that enabled the divine to be able to transmit its voice, if you like, to the Jewish people and to Moses. In a similar way, it seems that what the Yehuda Halevi is saying, the Kuzari is saying, is that in order for God to rest upon the Jewish people, there needs to be this tabernacle and the sacrifices in a very orderly fashion and with purity and wearing specific garments, etc. Just like the body needs to be ordered in a specific way, needs to be healthy in order for the soul to rest upon it, and in order for a person to get intelligence and to be able to reason. Although he tries to point out that the body isn't reason, he makes a separation between the body and reason. But reason is everywhere. Reason exists. Not everyone is as intelligent as the other person. And his view that is that the healthier you are, the better your body is, the more you'll be able to absorb the reason and absorb the soul. And therefore, the more you have of the tabernacle in an orderly way and set up in a particular manner with the sacrifices, and the sacrifices are similar to food, You need that as well. That is able to then bring down the divine presence. That's the way Yehuda Halevi sees the sacrifices. But it's really interesting because the question would be, well, what if we didn't have the tabernacle and the sacrifices? What would happen then? Well, it seems from the continuation of the discussion in the Kuzari that even without the sacrifices and without the tabernacle, the Jewish people can still accept the divine presence upon themselves, and they're inherently able to accept the divine presence within themselves. He talks about the Shabbat, he talks about circumcision and other types of commandments which also bring down the divine presence, and therefore it's a big question mark in my mind whether the Kuzari feels that it's absolutely necessary to have the sacrifices and the temple in order for the divine presence to actually rest upon the Israelites. It could be his view is that there are other ways in which to do it, Shabbat, circumcision, other mitzvot, and perhaps prayers as well, and all of that is now good enough in order to be able to bring the divine presence and to have that communication with the divine. The view which is very explicit that there is no longer a need for sacrifices is Maimonides. Maimonides, in the third part of his Guide to the Perplexed, chapter 32, makes it very clear that the only reason why we had sacrifices was in order to wean the Israelites off idolatrous practices. So in his view, the Israelites, the ancient Semites, were people who were very much accustomed to the practices of idol worship. And in the practice of idol worship, one of the ways in which you served idols was by bringing sacrifices. So that was very much the way in which people back then, in those ancient times, knew how to serve a god. It was through bringing up offerings, specifically offerings of meat, animals, slaughtering them and bringing them up. Some people brought human offerings as well. That was frowned upon in Judaism for the most part, and actually became a prohibition. Nonetheless, the way in which people back then, the ancient Semites, the people in ancient times, knew how to serve God was through bringing up offerings. Maimonides says that if they were told, no, you can't bring up offerings anymore, that would be similar to people today, or back in his times, in the 1200s, to be told that you can't pray anymore, you just have to meditate. People wouldn't understand what that means. Now, today, people probably understand that a little bit better. Meditation is a higher form of worship, according to Maimonides, not just Maimonides, according to others as well. Meditation is a higher form of worship than saying the prayers. But he says, if someone would have come in the 1200s and say, no, prayer is not a good way of worshipping, the only way you should worship is to meditate, he said people just wouldn't be able to accept that. Similarly, back in ancient times, if Moses would have come and said, you can't sacrifice to God, the ancient Semites would have said, well, what do you mean? How else should we worship? Well, you should pray. They wouldn't know what praying really is. And therefore, in order to bring them into the idea of monotheism, Moses said, instead of sacrificing to a multitude of gods, sacrifice only to one God, the God of Israel, the monotheistic God. And then it seems like over time the idea was to wean them off that practice as well, to bring them to a much higher level of practice, which eventually would be a meditative type of practice. So it seems quite explicit from that Maimonides is of the view that sacrifices are a lower level of worship of God than prayer, and prayer is a lower level of worship than meditation. Therefore, if the temple was rebuilt today, we probably, according to Maimonides, or at least this view presented Maimonides in the Guide for the Perplexed, we would no longer need in a temple today any types of sacrifices. Now, what's really interesting is that when people say this, and I have certainly presented this idea, this Maimonidean perspective to others, people get very defensive about it. And they say, no, Maimonides could not have said that. He couldn't have meant that. Maybe that's just in the Guide to the Perplexed. But there's a whole sections of halacha, and specifically in the Mishnah Torah, in Maimonides' Code of Jewish Law, which talks in great detail about all the sacrifices that need to be brought. And he also talks about when the coming of the Messiah, they're going to rebuild the temple. And obviously in the temple there's going to be sacrifices. So what do you mean that Maimonides doesn't believe in sacrifices in the future? In the third temple there will be sacrifices. Even according to Maimonides, it seems in his code. What I find really interesting about this is that we do live in a time when, if we wanted to, we could build a temple. Well, one might argue, well, Temple Mount, there's a mosque there, etc. And how are you going to build on the Temple Mount? Well, where there's a will, there's a way, number one. Number two, who says it has to be exactly on the Temple Mount? Exactly on where that mosque is. Maybe it could be somewhere else. In other words, if the rabbis really felt it was important enough for there to be sacrifices, they would find a way to do sacrifices. Look, we've got a whole book of the 5 books of Moses which talks about sacrifices. It's called Leviticus. It's the one we're reading now. Not only that, or half of the previous book of Exodus was talking about how to build the tabernacle and what goes on in the tabernacle. Sacrifices. So we've got 1.5 books at least talking about the tabernacle and the sacrifices. That's a large percentage of the 5 books of Moses. Sacrifices is central to Judaism. So if it's so important, wouldn't the rabbis have found a way around the idea that it only is on the Temple Mount, or the idea from Rabbi Akiva that we need to know the exact color of the garments of the priests are made out of? We find a way around that because there's tons of laws of mitzvot which are found in the Torah which cannot be carried out because we don't have a temple. So if we want to carry those out, can't just ignore them. We now do have sovereignty in the land of Israel. Shouldn't we be rebuilding a temple? And there are many people who argue that we should be. As a matter of fact, I have a friend of mine who I invited to have a conversation on the podcast about this because he believes that it is a sacred obligation of the Jewish people to rebuild the temple and to have the sacrifices reinstituted again. And his argument is that, just like I've made it, that there's so much of Jewish law and of the Torah which talks about it, you can't just ignore it. And he thinks that the fact that so many rabbis are ignoring it is actually a sin. But my perspective on it is slightly different. My perspective on it is that although they don't explicitly say so, most of rabbinic authorities today tacitly agree with Maimonides that the sacrifices are a more primitive mode of worship of God than prayer. And therefore, reinstituting a more primitive mode of worship is just not something they're going to do. Now, they don't explicitly say this. As a matter of fact, explicitly they say that they are looking forward to a time when the third temple will be built and will be bringing up these sacrifices again. But if they were really looking forward to it so much, why wouldn't they be agitating to build one now? Why wouldn't they bring at least some sacrifices like the Paschal lamb, like the Korban Pesach today, which doesn't have to be brought in the temple like the other sacrifices need to be brought in the temple? So why don't they at least do the Paschal lamb? The answer clearly seems to me to be because the rabbis today and Judaism today agrees, not explicitly, but tacitly with Maimonides. That actually, that was in order to help the Israelites wean them off idol worship. Now that we've been weaned off idol worship, now that for 2,000 years we have not brought sacrifices, instead we've prayed, and now many people know how to meditate as well, we're not going backwards, back to sacrifices. So there is that agreement with Maimonides that exists today. So the question then is, when we read Leviticus, all about the sacrifices, what are we to make of it today? Is this just some relic of the past that is not at all applicable to us in our lives today? And it's just an interesting piece of history that once upon a time the Israelites needed to be able to bring these sacrifices because that's the only way they knew how to worship. And now that we have prayers, we don't need that. And now that we meditate, we don't necessarily need prayers. Is that the way we should read the book of Leviticus? And to me, the answer is a little bit more complicated, because I really buy in to Maimonides' view here, which is that the sacrifices are a much more primitive mode of worship, and that I do not look forward to a time when they will rebuild the temple, and we will again bring sacrifices. I think that would be some negative, not a positive. And as a matter of fact, even the Kabbalists think that when the Messiah comes, we're going to have a lifting of consciousness to the degree that we will all know knowledge of the divine. We won't need sacrifices in order to bring us to a conscious awareness that we are connected with God in some way. We'll feel it innately, according to the Kabbalists. So the idea that somehow in the future, when we have this elevated consciousness of the divine, we will go back to sacrificing animals also doesn't seem logical in light of the Kabbalistic point of view of the Messianic era, which is when the third temple will be built. So what is the relevance then of reading about the sacrifices in Leviticus and Vayikra beyond this relic of history? Well, let me first say that I'm okay saying that it's a relic of history and that it has no actual value today. As a matter of fact, there are some mitzvot in the Torah, for example, Ben Seir Meir, that of the rebellious son, where the Talmud itself says that this is just lahagdil Torah lahadira. In other words, we have it today, although it's not relevant, but it's in order to learn more Torah. So it's okay if we have part of the Torah which isn't relevant, never will be relevant, but it's still something which we can continue to study as part of lahagdil Torah lahadira, to make Torah more beautiful and to make Torah greater. And that's fine. But in this case, I think there is some really deep wisdom here. Any action or speech or even thought that we take can either be positive or negative, or it could be neutral. And it's valuable for us to be cognizant and aware of what type of thought, speech, and action we are undertaking. Is it positive? Is it negative? Or is it neutral? And if it is negative, we should figure out a way of how can we get back on par. Anytime we do something which is negative, it's like we're detracting in some way from ourselves. Anytime that you get into a bad habit or you do something which isn't positive, you are detracting from your ability to live your best life, to fulfill your greatest potential. A negative habit or doing something negative actually means that you are weakening a part of yourself. Here's a good example: overeating. If we get into the habit of eating food which is bad for us, and in many ways we are what we eat, as we get older, we learn that the hard way, because when you're born, you have cholesterol of 50, and as you get older, your cholesterol starts to bump up, and if at some point you stop being careful with what you eat, you end up with high cholesterol, and that's because you're eating saturated fats, etc., and that can cause a plaque buildup and eventually heart disease. So you become very well aware that you are what you eat. And the more you get into a negative habit of eating things which are not good for you, the more it's difficult to then get back into a good habit of eating in a healthy way. So think about eating food which is bad for you as a sin. Every time you let yourself fall into the negative habit of eating food which is bad for you, and you're reinforcing that negative habit, and in some ways it's difficult to get back on par. Well, if you're aware of your eating habits, you can do something to fix it. So if you ate poorly one day, you might be able to balance it out the next day, or you might go on a run in the afternoon. You ate poorly for lunch, you go on a run in the afternoon. And that way you're able to bring yourself back to par. So think of these sacrifices as a way in which the Israelites were able to keep track of their behaviors, and if they sinned, they were able to do something to bring themselves back to par. In a sense, they brought this sacrifice to the tabernacle. They then gave it to the priest who sacrificed it for them, and that action of giving something away from themselves, like it says in the parasha, Adam ki yakriv mikem, a person who brings from themselves a korban, a sacrifice to God. And the idea here is they bring from themselves, they're giving something of themselves. In some way, they are therefore, by giving something of themselves, they're correcting that which was a mistake or a sin previously. So it's really important to be cognizant of one's behaviors, one's actions, one's speech, one's thoughts. And then if one realizes one's getting into a negative habit, then there are ways of fixing that, taking action to fix it, and learning what that action might be. Once upon a time, back in the tabernacle, they had a whole system, and there were sacrifices that you brought. Today, we no longer have sacrifices, but it's still important to be cognizant that one needs to get oneself back into balance. If one goes off balance by falling into a negative habit, one needs to take an action in the other way to get oneself back on balance. And something symbolic like a sacrifice really helps one get back on balance. So perhaps today it's giving some charity, perhaps it's doing a good deed, it's going for a run, doing some exercise, weights perhaps. There's all types of things one might think of doing in order to bring oneself back into balance after doing something which perhaps threw one off balance and could get one into negative habits. So that's perhaps a modern day application of the idea of the sacrifices. So we've gone on long in this episode. It's the first episode of the new series, Torah Portion Uncensored. And I hope that this is of benefit to you, my listener. I'm going to be doing this every single week on the Torah portion. But I hope that it remains relevant, it remains interesting and somewhat scholarly, and so it will be shorter in the future. But meanwhile, thank you so much for joining for this first episode of the latest season of Truth's Jewish Wisdom for Today. This has been Levi Brackman. Until next time.